session that includes the award winners of the 4 Best Paper Awards for the Strategizing Activities and Practices division. So we have a great menu of papers today. What we're going to do in terms of format is we will ask the presenters to present their papers in order for 10 minutes. Then we will have 10 minutes for discussion of each paper, which will leave us some time at the end for general discussion, we hope. And we very much look forward to hearing these papers. So I'm going to take us in order. And so the first paper is by Damla, Diriker, Philipp Tuertscher, and Amanda Wawarta. And wait a minute, I have to find the title of the paper. Maybe we can just play the paper. It's a very interesting paper about openness and closeness, which is a really topical issue in strategizing activities and practices. And like all the papers that we're going to hear today, it has rich qualitative data and has a kind of a process perspective. So I'm very pleased to be here to facilitate the session. So Damla, Greg, if you could play Damla's video, please.
Hello, I'm Damon Duke. I am a PhD student at the Vrije University Amsterdam, and I'm going to present your research on how open organizing can be used to tackle grand challenges. Several years ago, the United Nations announced the Sustainable Development Goals. Since then, thousands of companies have pledged to tackle some of the world's most pressing challenges as part of their business strategies. One initiative that addresses one of these goals, Life Below Water, is called Save Our Oceans, and it has been the focus of our study. Save Our Oceans is a foundation who realized that the problems around ocean sustainability were too complicated, and so tackling them should be a joint effort of all industry actors. Problems such as ocean pollution affect many stakeholders. It's not easy to figure out what the problem entails because they involve many interactions. It's not easy to address them because they involve persistent trade-offs, and there is no way to foresee how they will evolve in the future. There are no objectively right and wrong solutions for such problems because each of us can interpret the problem and its potential solutions in our own way. This makes it difficult for any single actor to understand the problem's complexities and come up with innovative solutions individually. And because of this, grand challenges cannot be tackled with a traditional and close approach to organizing. And instead, we need an open approach that does not restrict problem solving and decision making to a small group of so-called experts. Openness in organizations can be distinguished along 2 key dimensions: inclusion and transparency. Inclusion refers to opening the process to a greater number of internal and external actors, and transparency is about increasing the visibility of information. While this open approach may offer many benefits to organizations, like increased creativity or joint sense-making of the grand challenges, these benefits may actually be difficult to accomplish in practice. Past studies have provided us with ample examples of organizations that consistently designed their organizing processes to be as open as possible, but ironically, ended up excluding the stakeholders they wanted to include or decreasing the visibility of information they wanted to disclose in the first place. We often assumed that reducing inclusion and transparency would in turn limit openness, and considered these instances of exclusion and opacity as something that organizations need to avoid to achieve higher levels of openness. In this paper, we argue that this may not actually be the case. Following the constitutive view of openness, we consider that any form of openness inherently implies certain forms of closures. And we argue that we need to take a closer look at closure to truly understand open organizing as it unfolds over time. So we ask the following research questions. How do different practices of closure generate openness? And how is this movement between openness and closure orchestrated over time? The context of our research, Save Our Oceans, represents an interesting case for us to answer our research questions, because the organizing approach was characterized by openness throughout the process. As individual companies do not possess all the necessary knowledge and expertise to develop and implement solutions for the sustainable use of the oceans by themselves, they decided to team up and organize an open innovation challenge. So 30 partner organizations jointly selected and defined the challenge problems they wanted to tackle. They used a crowdsourcing platform to collect and develop ideas collaboratively. They then evaluated these ideas together and selected the most promising ones to be further developed into viable business plans. We conducted interviews with different stakeholders involved in this process. We observed meetings and different events and took detailed field notes. We collected documents and had access to the emails of the organizers, as well as the platform data and the social media accounts of Save Our Oceans. We analyzed this data with a process approach combined with elements of grounded theory. What we have found is that there were many instances of inclusion and transparency, but also exclusion and opacity throughout the organizing process of Save Our Oceans. A primary insight of our study is the identification of punctuated openness, which are the strategic moves that the organizers of the process performed to generate and sustain openness through practices of closure. We observed punctuated openness in different instances throughout the process. I am going to highlight only some of these as our time is limited, but you can find all these details in our paper. So the process in Save Our Oceans was organized in 6 phases. We found that the organizers began each of these phases with an extremely open approach. For instance, at the beginning of the project, where the organizers were looking for partner organizations, they did not define any guidelines, a general structure for the project, nor did they have any preferences about which organizations they wanted to involve in this initiative. However, they realized that they ended up excluding participants they wanted to involve in the first place, as participants did not know why or how they could contribute. This often led to periods of inaction. The organizers corrected these by defining rules and instructions for participation. For example, by creating a timeline and indicating important phases of activity and milestones, they managed to provide the potential partners with a clear vision, and so they defined the boundaries for different activities. In other cases, they selectively involved and excluded different actors from the process by fluctuating between different groups of actors. For instance, while representatives of partner organizations were involved in defining and formulating the challenge problems, it was the public, challenge moderators, and the employees from partner organizations who were most actively involved in idea generation. In most cases, these were successful in generating the desired levels of inclusion. However, generating the desired levels of inclusion did not mean that this would directly be transferred to the following phases in the process. For instance, when moving from one phase to another, from the formulation of the challenge problems to the generation of ideas, the organizers realized that they needed to modify the challenge areas by broadening them so that they'd have a better appeal to diverse individuals and a better chance to generate large quantities of ideas in the subsequent phase. This allowed Wawarta to bridge across different phases in the process. And all of these forms of openness and closure were closely monitored by the organizers to make sure that they were generating the desired levels of inclusion and transparency throughout the process. Overall, in the study, we aim to show the interplay between openness and closure over time as a dynamic process. We expand the literature on open organizing by showing that the combination of different forms of openness and closure helps organizations generating and sustaining the desired levels of inclusion and transparency over time. We call this movement between openness and closure punctuated openness, where legitimate closures become necessary to sustain punctuated moments of openness across time. We argue that punctuated openness provides a promising direction for thinking about how open organizing can be designed by taking closure seriously, both as an inevitable consequence of openness and also as an intentional mechanism for ensuring the quality and sustainability of openness over time. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and we are looking forward to hearing your feedback.
So thank you very much, Damla, for that very succinct and nice presentation of your paper. I should mention that this paper won the SAP Division's Best Paper Award. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
In order to start comments, please, everyone. Well, first of all, Renee, I will ask you to comment, and others, if you have comments, either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can give you the microphone, I believe.
Okay. So I'll make a start. Thank you, Anne, and thanks for the great presentation. I think the topic is very interesting. You know, this interplay of openness and closure over time, and so it's no surprise that it's you know won an award. It's a really interesting paper. Now, so my comments, I'm just going to make some more general comments, and you can either you can take them or leave them. I would, so I'll just start with a few general things. I think it would be really interesting to increase the clarity somewhat on the dynamics and outcomes. And what do I mean by this? I mean, with the research question, so I find the research question really interesting. How are modes of openness and closure orchestrated over time? But I think what would also be useful is then to say, to achieve what? What is the outcome? So the focus is obviously on generating innovation. So I think that should become part of the research question, at least in my mind. So how are modes of openness and closure orchestrated over time, either to generate innovative ideas or to effectively implement innovative ideas, and so that we're clearer about what the outcome or the intended outcome is. Because I think there are a lot of interesting interplays we could play with in terms of openness and closure, but it might be good to have more of a focus here. Also, I think you do a great job in the front end of the paper in terms of distinguishing between different types of openness. And I would suggest to follow through with that and maybe to think about maybe a more precise distinction of types of openness in the analysis, maybe beyond inclusion and transparency. And I was thinking about this myself, and I started to develop my own little table, a matrix, a 5x3 matrix of different types of openness. I think there's a lot you could do here, which would be really interesting, and see how one element might shape the other elements. So you ask, for instance, what suggestions are permissible? How does that link with, for instance, what materials are made available to the participants, and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff I think that would be really interesting to explore and to see what kind of general mechanisms we could derive from that. So it's those links between the different types of openness and then the outcome that you're looking for. And then maybe more of a question, but also half comment, and I'll end it there, is in terms of you highlight some fundamental openness issues in the paper, which we know about from the decision-making literature, from the negotiation literature, from the creativity literatures. So we know, for instance, the more choices that are available to you, the more difficult it can be to make decisions, right? Because you can quickly become overwhelmed. We also know the more people that are involved in a process, the more difficult it can be to reach consensus, right? Due to different interests and understandings. And I think it would be really a good idea to then clarify in your paper, apart from these two kind of really well-known dynamics regarding, the issues around openness, what other ones that you bring to the table and you relate to these two particular mechanisms, that we are very much aware of. So, like I said, these are just some general comments that I made, that I prepared. Take them or leave them, and I've also got some very specific comments about the paper that I'm very happy to share offline with the authors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Renee. Damla, Philipp, and Amanda, would you like to respond to any of those comments?
Yeah, I can start. Thanks, Anna, for the comments. You are absolutely right about making a more precise distinction between different types of openness and closure. This is what actually we are now trying to do to move forward with the paper. So this interplay between openness and closure, this is what we are looking at right now to be more precise about different modes and different sub-dimensions of openness and closure. So inclusion and exclusion and transparency and opacity. So I totally agree. Amanda, Philipp, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can add to that. So we're now breaking down the case to look at openness and closure along the dimensions of participants, content, and purposes. And this is drawing on previous research on open organizing and strategy, open strategy. So this, we hope to have, a more fine-grained look, and by doing that, be able to extrapolate from that some more theoretical insights. Because we think we have it in the data, because we do have very rich data. And so working through this data with more specific subdimensions is our current task. So it's nice to hear this feedback and this comment that would be useful.
I see that there's a question in the chat, so from Katarina Dietrich, and I think Bridget Rez will have a very similar comment. So great paper, thank you. I was wondering whether you can elaborate a bit on what triggers closure and openness, i.e. when do they need to close? For example, you mentioned closure was important as they shift from one phase to another, so perhaps you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, in general, what we see in our case is that closure was kind of a reaction to some unintended consequences of openness that the organizers and the participants were experiencing. For example, when they were extremely open, they didn't define any rules, any structures. They were like, oh, we will go talk to potential partners and see who will join us. They saw that this didn't work, so they had to close down by defining some rules and structures for the whole process. So what we see in our case is that closure is kind of a mechanism to avoid these unintended consequences of openness that they had to perform in order to sustain and reach the desired levels of inclusion and transparency.
And I can add to that. So that was one instance in which, closure is then triggered and needed. But another one was in trying to move this process across time and across the different participants. So you had different participants in different phases. And so, for example, this bridging between phases where they would actually modify strategic content, for example, to make it broader so that it appealed to more people, that was a desire to sustain the inclusion of past participants who would become important in later phases, but also make it appealing to the future participants that were coming up in future phases. So I think that's two examples. There's others, but I think that gives a good indication.
I think that this is great, but I am conscious of time, and so I think we need to move forward. I just had one comment for you that maybe you might look at the boundary work literature. So this is about boundaries, and what that would do is kind of raise it to a higher level of abstraction. I don't know whether that's absolutely necessary, but it might be interesting either to see what the boundary work literature has to say about your case, and also to consider whether you can make a contribution to that literature as well. And it's possible that you might be able to. So that's, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to the second paper, which is actually the best student paper for strategizing activities and practices division. And we have Christina, who is going to share her screen. So it's Christina Wawarta, Loizos Heracleous, and Sotirios Paroutis. And their paper is about NASA and temporal tensions at NASA. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Anne, for this introduction. I will present the paper for our author team that I want to introduce very briefly before we dive into the content of the paper. So the paper has been written by my doctoral supervisors, Loizos Heracleous and Sotirios Paroutis, and myself, all from Warwick Business School. And we want to use this opportunity here very briefly to also thank the reviewers for their helpful comments, and also the award committee for selecting us for this fantastic award. So coming to the paper, I was very lucky to be able to conduct my research at NASA, which is a very interesting organization, due to links that Loizos had with the organization before. And I went there with an inductive approach, letting the data speak to me and seeing what patterns may emerge. And one thing that really struck me was the frequent changes that the organization has to deal with and the uncertainty it is experiencing due to the fact that it is very closely linked to the US administration and their changing goals, what they want to achieve with the space agency. And so to illustrate this, I have here the destinations that are possible or likely to be part of NASA's plans or strategies going forward. And I want to illustrate this a bit to you by looking at the past administration. So starting with President Kennedy, who obviously wanted to go to the moon. We have firstly here in the middle the moon as the destination. Because the moon landing was so expensive, President Nixon wanted to focus more on the vicinity of Earth with the space shuttle and the ISS orbiting the Earth, so wanting to stay within low Earth orbit. That was reversed by President Bush Sr. actually, and then later especially Bush Jr., who wanted to return back to the moon. That was canceled by President Obama thereafter when he said, no, that's too expensive. We will focus on going to an asteroid and retrieve some samples, and we will also seed the commercial space industry to explore eventually deep space destinations in public-private partnerships like going to Mars eventually. And then once President Trump took office, he then canceled again this asteroid mission, but wanted to go back to the moon, and that's the current plan at the moment, to return to the moon by 2024. So as you can see, there is a going back and forth between these different destinations, which have on what NASA does, as these missions are very complex and often lasts for 20 to 30 years in terms of preparation and then execution. And we think that this is a very interesting context, which is not only exclusive to the space industry, but to a lot of industries which have very long research and development timelines as well as implementation. And so here is a quote that illustrated this well, how the organization is whiplashed because the destination is changing, and that this will make NASA eventually become obsolete because it's not part of the race anymore. So our research question was, how do actors deal with temporal tensions during long-term strategic change initiatives? And we looked at NASA and specifically at the Exploration, Integration and Science Directorate at the Johnson Space Center, who is responsible for orchestrating in the long term the human space initiatives. We collected rich qualitative data, which not only was focused on the time we were there between 2016 and 19, but in a longer time frame from the inception of NASA. We collected lots of interviews, observational notes, and documents for this reason. So we looked at theory, time and management studies, and we have found that time has been an implicit consideration of management studies for a very long time, but explicitly it has not been looked upon in great depth until recently. Recently, there has been a temporal turn, and researchers are researching what managers are actually doing with time and with respect to time-related phenomena. And we found especially interesting what Kunis and others said, that managers can use time as a key resource to achieve strategic outcomes. And that was our launching point in this regard. What we then did with our data was we looked at the whole existence of NASA and bracketed 3 phases. So phase 1 of temporal continuity, phase 2 of temporal discontinuity, and phase 3 of temporal uncertainty, which go along with the environment climate that we observed, which in the beginning was very stable because they were all unified behind one goal, like the Apollo goal going to the moon. Later on, it became already a bit uncertain when the first big mission was canceled without achieving any major goals that were associated with it. And then nowadays, the climate is one where it seems that every administration taking office is out of consequence canceling what the administration before has been doing. And so with this, we have also identified different practices of temporal work, how you can manage these temporal tensions that arise through these new strategic initiatives popping up and being in tension with existing ones and the long-term aspiration of NASA doing a human space exploration for the benefit of humankind. And so in the first phase, what we saw, because there was no experience of any cancellations before, that whenever there was a new trigger, a new space initiatives, for example, that was also maybe in tension with the one before. And what NASA did was they just had change-related temporal practices. And what we mean with this, they changed everything what they were doing, focused on this new trigger, and this led to the outcomes associated with the initial trigger. Later on, when the first major initiative was canceled, that was the asteroid, that was the return to the moon by Obama, who then wanted to go to the asteroid. It was when millions were invested, but none of the originally associated goals were achieved. That made them retrospectively think what the long-term temporal implications of that was and what they may be able to reuse going forward. So first, long-term thinking associated with the change-related temporal practices. And that then led to phase 3, where we nowadays witness that there is a very explicit, proactive, long-term thinking, which we have now termed vision-related here, because we see it very much linked to the organizational vision of the organization to do human exploration of space. And we see that there is a lot of thinking around that organizational vision, which, as we will show on the next slides, will either inhibit or facilitate the change-related temporal practices on the surface level. So to sum up the findings very quickly, we distinguish between the short-term and the long-term temporal work practices. We observe that the change-related practices are more on the observable level, whereas the vision-related ones are more implicit and tacit oftentimes, and that both of these types of temporal practices can either inhibit or facilitate the originally planned outcome, which was associated with new strategic initiatives. And we saw that there is a need. And we also saw that in our data that the organization gradually developed a capability to manage these temporal tensions. And that is what I will illustrate in this process model here very briefly. So here is basically what I have shown before, the last phase in which we're currently in, with the change-related and vision-related temporal practices, which either facilitate or inhibit the originally planned outcome. But what we argue is that there is an assessment of temporal and strategic fit going on, which the organization is performing and which is part of that newly developed dynamic capability, which influences whether a temporal tension is being perceived and whether there are some underlying maybe inhibiting vision-related temporal practices, while there are surface level facilitating change-related practices that one can observe. So in terms of contributions, we extend the existing literature on temporality and temporal work by focusing on long-term strategic timeframes, which has not been done in the past. We unpack the two types of categories because we were able to do so due to our long-term study with the short-term and the long-term orientation of practices. And we also showed that there's an interplay of effects that may be even contrary to each other of these short and long-term temporal work practices. And we developed a corresponding model, which also leads to, as we argue, a dynamic capability if an organization really engages in this temporal work practices that allows the organization to balance temporal tensions and keep a long-term goal sustainably alive, even though there may be short-term changes in between that may threaten that long-term aspiration. And with this, thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward for your feedback to further refine the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. If you could remove the sharing, that would be helpful because I can't really see the chat. You do that. Okay. Okay, so thank you, Christina. Our lead commentators, discussants on this paper were Kate, Layla, and Richard, and I don't know whether you coordinated around who is going to talk, but please.
Thank you, Anne. I think we'll probably all chime in with something because it's such a rich paper. There's so much there. So thank you very much, Christina, for your presentation. I read and really appreciated the 2019 JABS paper on NASA. I found it fascinating and so helpful. So I was really excited to see a new theoretical lens brought to that amazing story that you have to work with. I think one of the really significant challenges of ethnographic fieldwork is that we try to distill all of those hours, the atmosphere, those moments of observation, even the relationships that we build through interview and so on. And we have to distill all of that down into a few tables of illustrative quotes, maybe a vignette or two here or there. And it's excruciating, isn't it, as a qualitative researcher to try and do that. And it must be even more so when you do have such amazing data to work with. I wondered whether the empirical detail of that table 4 might be brought to life a little bit more in the body of the paper, because it is such wonderful, wonderful material to work with. It might be helpful. I wondered if you could build in a little more specificity around the nature of temporal tensions, maybe that could be an interesting avenue to explore. There are some references that I think Richard might be able to provide later around, from Dawson and Sykes, quite recent work around temporality and change, which if you haven't already looked at might be interesting. But I think the area I would be really interested to find out more about is how you distinguish between the vision and the change related temporal practices in a little more detail. That for me, I could see where it was headed, but I was hungry for more, I suppose. And I was curious too whether that was something that your participants brought or had distinguished, or whether that was an overlay, a theoretical overlay that you were able to bring to the data.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Christina, can you address that?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for these very helpful comments, Kate. And you were completely right with saying that it is so difficult to condense all the richness of ethnographic, in-depth work into these few pages. And certainly we were struggling to point to the most significant parts and to really focus on them. With regards to the specificity and the definition of temporal tensions, that is something that we're currently already looking into, and that is also related to your later point regarding the change and vision related practices and how do you theoretically distinguish between those. And we have advanced our thinking and reading of more recent literature in that regard, but just not have been able to implement it yet in the paper. But one idea that we had was that the change and division related practices may be linked to different kinds of thinking modes that one can cycle into, or that the practices cycle into, and so that may be a theoretical grounding for distinguishing between change and vision related ones. That is a bit more substantive than the definition we provided so far, but that's still work in progress.
Okay, did Layla and Richard have any comments as well?
Hi, yeah, I had a comment, if possible, please, and hopefully you can all hear me. Just want to say first, what a fantastic context within which to explore temporal processes. I don't think you can get somewhere better than NASA with that huge timescape that you've managed to explore in your data. Thoroughly enjoyed reading the paper. So my question, given that context and that shifting of the context across phases 1, 2, and 3 in your research, thinking about phase 3 specifically, is whether temporal tensions and temporal practices are primarily intra-organizational in character or inter-organizational in character. Because it just strikes me that in the current phase, we have this kind of public versus private space race, which is a really interesting context within which to explore your kind of distinction between change-related temporal practices and vision-related temporal practices potentially. And then you've got another thing, because it's not just a dyad, it's a triad. You've also got the politicians that you mentioned that are also the funders of NASA. I just wondered whether you were looking primarily on that kind of inter-organizational kind of temporal tension, temporal practice dynamic, or at that wider kind of inter-organizational view.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Thank you very much for this fantastic comment. And we should probably look into that a bit more and foreground it, because it does have significant implications. So NASA is struggling as an incumbent organization of space with the new work practices of a SpaceX or a Blue Origin and what else there is, Virgin Galactic. And they have to collaborate more intensely than ever before, especially because they are pursuing this shared model, this network model. And so a lot of these work practices that we have observed that may enable the focus on the long-term goal, even though short-term there may be some distractions, are actually coming from the outside. Like being more adaptive in terms of planning, so agile working methods in this regard, or like, and so probably it would be interesting to provide more detail on that, even though it extends the paper again, which is then the challenge, right?
Maybe I can also add something to Christina's answer. Thank you, Layla, and thank you, Kate, for your amazing points on the paper and your kind words. So as to whether the practices are intra or inter-organizational, necessarily from the ethnographic data, what we can observe is intra-organizational, but a couple of the practices are explicitly inter-organizational, such as in table 4, we have flexible contracting. We also have further down path dependency creation, which is also about keeping contractual obligations more flexible. So in that sense, those are, if you like, intra-organizational behaviors that affect inter-organizational relationships. And given the evolution of NASA to the commercial network model, maybe we should be paying more attention to that issue. And just to add also something to Christina's answer to Kate's comment, it's a very interesting question, what distinguishes change-related from vision-related practices. And we hadn't really thought much about that, but asking the question helps us think a bit more. And to my mind is when we observe some practices, ethnographically, the intent of those practices matters most. And we know that we can't, of course, we all know we can't look into people's minds, but through triangulation, through attending meetings, history, understanding of culture, looking at documents, we can understand what the intent is and where the intent is coming from. And I think that's where primarily we base the initial assessment. I don't know if Christina will agree with what I just said.
Yes, I do, and that was what our current definition is based upon, and which we will also keep. But I think what is still worthwhile to think about is how we can nevertheless probably specify or define it even more so that it's better graspable.
So on the chat, Minfa has an interesting comment, and I think it would be helpful to respond to it. So he says, very interesting presentation and congratulations. A question about how external are these changes of direction? So does NASA have no say in these changes? And if they do, how does that reflect in your theorizing? It must be very frustrating if it's the former, and if so, how do they deal with such frustrations? So my understanding is the vision-related practices have something to do with being ready to have to change. But I think Amit's question is really, do they have no agency whatsoever to try and make what they're doing irreversible, so that politicians can't just throw out what they've been doing?
I think there's an interplay between the whims of the current presidency and the long-term path dependency. The interplay takes place in the sense that even though current presidents may have certain favorites, they also have advisors who let them know what NASA had been investing on for decades. There's also public opinion that's more or less supports exploration. And so if a president has whims that are very much out of line with the history of NASA, with the sunk costs, and with public opinion, they either won't make those preferences apparent, or they will dress them down. And they will allow most of the projects of NASA to continue while adding on their favorite. For example, the asteroid capture mission that Obama wanted to do, clearly NASA, well, we are probably being recorded, but I will say that only a few people at NASA took that seriously because they knew that the next president might not agree that there was a good commitment of resources to capture an asteroid. I don't know if Christina wants to add anything, or Sotirios.
Yeah, I completely second you, Loizos, and maybe also in terms of looking ahead, there is also the practice of, and Loizos already alluded to that to create favorable scenarios for the president to choose from. And so that is also a practice that helps them keep on building what they had already been doing. And then there is just this limited set of options, but obviously one that can never know what a president then decides. So there is still uncertainty associated, but of course they try to especially in recent years, to limit that, because they are aware of the possibility that everything they had been doing, all the millions that went into these developments, can be just extinguished.
Okay, well, I think we have to stop the discussion for the moment here, and please save your questions for later, because I hope we'll have some time at the end for discussion about this. So now it would be Kate, Layla, and Richard's turn to do their presentation. So please share your screen. So just one comment before you get going. This paper is this strategizing activities and practices best practice oriented paper. So congratulations.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Booth. I'm presenting on behalf of Layla Branicki and Richard Badham, my co-authors. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from where I speak to you today, the Darug people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. And as an author team, we thank Dr. Katarina Dietrich and the reviewers, and of course Professor Anne Langley as well, for the opportunity to present today, and to the awards committee for recognising our paper in this way. It's a great honour, so thank you all. And I should say to everyone who has risen early or stayed up late to be here live, thank you as well. Our paper is concerned with mindful ambidexterity, but that's not where we began, it's where we end. So first, some background about where this paper is set. Corco is a medium-sized service firm active in Australia and New Zealand. Corco was interesting for many reasons. But here, because during fieldwork it was undergoing significant change, implementing what we would call an ambidextrous strategy. Its traditional business was in providing outsourced call centres on behalf of its clients. So if you called a company, you would speak to Corco staff who were trained and equipped to talk to you about that client's products or services. Now, the firm's exploration was in artificial intelligence, which of course is said to eventually replace large parts of people's activities with software. So these so-called chatbots take and triage customer contacts. Now, outsource succeeds by being leaner and more efficient, driving harder than anyone else. So to achieve the same or better outcomes, but making their sometimes slim profit margins. However, to explore in the artificial intelligence domain meant speculative investment, experimentation, bringing in new capabilities, a new vocabulary, and a new way for Corco to think of itself as being in the customer experience or CX world, rather than simply call centres. So as you might imagine, for some the participants in the study, these dual pursuits, so continuing the traditional business while exploring in a new domain, were very strange bedfellows, and they created some interrelated tensions. So we know that the pursuit of ambidexterity involves handling contradictions, at times competing logics of exploitation and exploration, So per James March, of course, exploitation concerns efficiency, control, certainty, and variance reduction, whereas exploration concerns search, discovery, innovation. So to pursue ambidexterity then is to navigate hosting those multiple contradictory structures, processes, and cultures within the same firm. Tushman and O'Reilly give us that. Now, some recent scholarship has suggested that navigating ambidexterity requires some form of enriched awareness. So we take that notion and we look to collective mindfulness as a set of 5 processes understood to create and sustain enriched awareness and a capacity for action. The overall goal of the research was to explore the management of uncertainty, drawing on concepts from high reliability organising, known in the literature as collective mindfulness or mindful organising. So this is the work of Carl Weick, Kathleen Sutcliffe, Tim Vergas and others. So research in collective mindfulness is generally about extreme contexts, but in this work, we follow in the footsteps of scholars including Klaus Rehrup and Tim Vergas, and we apply the concepts to mainstream organisational settings. Now, in this study, we've referred to collective mindfulness per Weick and colleagues, and it's seen as encompassing 5 processes. Processes which support anticipation of the unexpected, a preoccupation with failure, a reluctance to simplify interpretations, a sensitivity to operations, and also further 2 processes which contain, so that's a commitment to resilience and a deference to expertise. So these are ongoing, effortful social processes, and they're understood to support sustained performance under uncertainty. The mindfulness does appear in the ambidexterity literature, in the research of Rehrup and Turner and colleagues as well. However, references to mindfulness are brief and quite incidental. Our research also tends to refer to mindfulness at the individual level of analysis per Ellen Langer, rather than extending those ideas to the collective level, as do Vergas and Sutcliffe, Weick and others. So recognising ambidexterity as an organisational accomplishment, in this paper, we suggest that mobilising a collective form of mindfulness in analysis is both appropriate and likely to yield some fresh insights. So this brings us to our research question. We ask, how do the social processes of collective mindfulness help managers to anticipate and contain the challenges and tensions inherent in pursuit of organisational ambidexterity? The group CEO originally introduced me to the firm as walking alongside us, which I did for more than 3 years through a period of great change. The resulting data are diverse and detailed: recorded meetings, strategy away days, unstructured interviews and corridor conversations of ethnographic fieldwork. But the nature of access that we had and the data that we collected meant that we felt well positioned to respond to a need identified in the literature for more on the managerial practices and the day-to-day, the lived experience of pursuing ambidexterity. So for Callco, pursuing this strategy set up contradictions along a number of dimensions. As one example, at Callco, key managers had spent their whole careers in human-based call centres, which brought in the revenue. There was a strong sense that we earn the cash to pay for the rest, and that the bright and shiny were distractions, the toys of exploration, and that might hint at the social tensions to come. One of the key insights from this work is that both ambidexterity and collective mindfulness are fragile. They're continuously accomplished and reaccomplished by managers in their daily practices. From the 1990s to 2018, we identified 5 phases in Callco's approach. The firm combined exploitation with incremental innovation, but was hit hard by offshoring and loss of remaining clients to competitors who were selling a dream of more radical technological innovation at that time. Through phases 2 and 3, Callco introduced small-scale experimental exploration in various fields using existing staff. Then came a serendipitous contact from a client who was willing to partner with Callco to explore artificial intelligence technology, and an exciting new phase of exploration began. One executive admitted that they had to Google what the client was asking for. In phase 4, Callco began to explicitly incorporate both disruptive innovation and traditional lines of business, the combination of contextual and then increasingly structural ambidexterity. While there was great optimism at executive level, new revenues didn't accelerate as quickly as they'd hoped. And later in phase 4, we see a renewed focus on profitability, a pulling back from investment and orientation towards short-term performance. However, as phase 4 ends, Qualco's by now growing reputation for innovation was instrumental in securing large new contracts which tripled the size of the organisation within months. As those new accounts entered the delivery mode in phase 5, broader exploration activities were sidelined. From the senior exploration manager's perspective, he said, "We won those big accounts, a blend of our traditional business, our innovation capability, and we said, we can deliver this. And then we got into delivering it, and suddenly it wasn't about the full vision anymore. It dropped back just to getting bums on seats." So our narrative ends then with phase 5, as Qualco transferred its disruptive innovation activities to a separate entity in the parent company group, so a form of domain ambidexterity, and the company returned its focus back to its own exploitation activities and delivering on those new contracts. Now, the neat line of this figure simplifies what was a turbulent, highly charged emotional time. Our paper then analyses a series of tensions through the lens of collective mindfulness. Tensions between an entrepreneurial optimism and so-called realism in the eyes of others. There were tensions around expertise, as new subject matter specialists resented the need to appease the existing generalist managers. And then in turn, the generalists were suspicious of the specialists. There was also all of the expected tussles over resource allocation across exploitation and exploration. In transitioning towards an ambidextrous orientation, Qualco also sought to refine and extend ideas about its identity, who we are, what we do, and for whom. So we draw on our analysis of these tensions to form our inductive model. We find that social processes of collective mindfulness make a dual contribution to ambidexterity. First, collective mindfulness helps managers navigate ambidexterity because its processes help managers to better anticipate the contradictions and tensions that emerge. Secondly, collective mindfulness helps managers to handle ambidexterity because its processes help managers to contain the interpersonal, team and organisational tensions. So in this paper, we contribute a rich empirical story of the lived experience of ambidexterity, its contradictions, its tensions, and we propose an inductive model of connections between collective mindfulness and ambidexterity. Further, we propose mindful ambidexterity as an ongoing and effortful process, which draws upon enriched awareness to commit attention and resources flexibly towards exploitation and exploration as and when needed by the business. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to your comments and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you unshare the screen, please? Thank you. Okay, so it's Damla and Philipp and Amanda's turn to comment. So one of you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to speak for us. Thank you, Kate and colleagues, for this very nice paper and also for this very nice presentation. So the three of us, we all got very excited about the paper. Actually, we were meeting this morning to just share our thoughts, and we got carried away a little bit in our discussion about your paper. So that's just as a indication of how interesting we found the paper. Actually, I even found the presentation more interesting because you shared a little bit more of the specific context up front. And actually, I think your context is quite valuable. I think it informs a little bit the reader about the boundary condition. And I think it would be nice to even make that a little bit part of your research problem of that specific situation. But anyway, so we exchanged our thoughts, and we had more comments, I guess, than I'm allowed to share now, given the time constraints, but we're also happy to share later on. So let me just share a couple of questions as the tip of the iceberg. So first, let me say I really found the concept of collective mindfulness. I was very excited about that when I was studying organizations that need to get things right the first time, organizations that can't afford to fail, like high reliability organizations. But there's also other more mundane organizations. But what I found, and that's consistent also with Vike and Roberts and Sutcliffe's works, is that mindfulness is something that's performed really as a group performance. It involves all the people. And here in this case, these people appear to be the managers only. So the senior managers and also middle managers. But when I compare this to the original work on mindful performance in high reliability organizations or the like, it's firefighters, flight deck operations and aircraft carriers and things like that. And there, the collective mind involves the participation of everyone. Not just the commanders. And an aircraft carrier could not show mindful performance if just the captain and the commanders are involved. So I was curious, how does this translate to your setting? Is it really possible to talk about mindfulness as an organizational concept when you just talk about managers? Or can you extend this, or do you have to extend this maybe even also to others in the organizations, other actors who are involved in this process of exploration and exploitation? So that was one set of questions that we had. A second set of comments that we were sharing was around the different concepts of ambidexterity that we know. So in your discussion, you distinguish your concept of mindful ambidexterity from both sequential or also contextual ambidexterity. It would be nice if you could discuss this a little bit more critically also and reflect upon it. To what extent is it really a different form of ambidexterity? Because it was at times quite similar for us, especially to contextual ambidexterity, where depending on the circumstances, on the situations, the people enact different forms of ambidextrous organizing, depending on the circumstances. But you may not even have to pick this fight to show how yours is different. I think your contribution potentially could be very interesting and very valuable in just explaining how these different forms of ambidexterity can be navigated, how managers can mindfully transition between different forms of ambidexterity. So that's a second set of comments. And the third set of comments that was around the way you're presenting ambidexterity as tensions that need to be ameliorated. So given paradox perspectives or theories are so en vogue, and I've also seen sessions on emphasizing the importance of both and solutions rather than either or solutions, I think it would be nice to also embrace that perspective a little bit and think about to what extent are these really tensions that the managers need to overcome or to avoid, rather than tensions that they can address and leverage, maybe. And specifically also when it comes to ambidextrous organizing, this is home office. To the extent, specifically to ambidextrous organizing, I think you can also build on prior work on looking at this as a duality rather than a dualism. If I'm thinking about Moshe Farshun's work in AMR, that's looking at how ambidextrous organizing has both elements of stability and change in there. I think this would be very nice ingredients to look to what extent actually this is something that you need to avoid rather than organizations can build on. I think I need to stop it there.
Okay, so would you like to respond, Kate?
Thank you. And Thank you so much. There was so much there, Emma, to work with. Really terrific feedback. A comment around the frontline staff in the structure of the organisation that we were in. We talk about collective mindfulness as being constituted by the organisation, and within the meetings, that make up the organisation itself, and the nature of Callco, where you have a very large workforce on the phones, and then you have a specialist workforce engaged in the exploration activities with the senior management team sitting above them. I think you're right. I think there are definitely voices that we could bring out more strongly from those involved in exploration. The technical manager in particular does have some great material to work with. So thank you. I'll look back into that, I think. Layla, did you want to respond at all on any of the ambidexterity points that were made?
Hello. Yeah, what fantastic comments. Thank you so much. It sounds like you had a great debate this morning about ambidexterity. I almost wish I'd been there for the full debate. Yes, I think broadly speaking, we agree. And I think the thing that we've been talking about most recently is the ways in which mindful social practices might affect or perhaps effect the execution of strategy. And I think that's why we were drawn to kind of the managerial perspective, particularly because there are still so many gaps in the ambidexterity work in relation to that messy lived reality of how managers handle kind of both the upside and the downside of that pursuit of ambidexterity. And I think we were really keen in this work, I think, as others already emphasised in their own work, to make that distinction between pursuit of ambidexterity as a kind of practice and lived experience versus ambidexterity as an outcome, which we kind of move away from in our study. And I agree with you about the adjacency specifically in relation to contextual ambidexterity. And this is something we really toyed with for a long time. This paper that the version we submitted to AOM is probably about 27 iterations in the making. So this has been a long run, not quite as long run as what you were talking about in NASA, Christina, but a long run task for us. And we're still kind of refining that distinction. But I think primarily we come back to that Hebe and Simsek work about really trying to understand how the social processes of collective mindfulness can help with that enriched kind of attentiveness within managers to both anticipating the problems that can be presented as a result of that pursuit of ambidexterity that we saw in our data, but also potentially going further in not only anticipating them, but containing them before they derail that pursuit of ambidexterity. And it's the second part of that conundrum that I think we haven't developed far enough. And as we develop it further, I think that distinction to contextual ambidexterity will become more apparent. I don't know if that fully addresses so many rich questions that you asked, but hopefully it's helpful. And I don't know if Richard wants to say something briefly about paradox.
Yeah, it could be quick because we do need to give time to Renee and yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, I think a big thing, I'm trying to be very quick. The mindful ambidexterity is not a type of ambidexterity, it's an approach to handling ambidexterity. And a big thing, that the wide thing on mindfulness tends to be rather cognitive. As you got from Kate, there's a lot about relationships and emotions between what people are doing. So what we're trying to do is capture the relationships and the emotions and the embodied nature of being mindful. And as part of this activity, we actually created well, it's a Boalian script where you had Rob and Gav as one was the exploitative guy, one was the exploration, and they're having a fight. And it's up to the managers to debrief to try and solve the fight. And it's all highly about relationships, body language, interactions, emotions, which I think we should probably extend that a bit. Sorry, Anna.
It's okay. Thank you so much. I mean, it's obviously, these are really rich papers and there's a lot to say, and that's great. There's some more comments on the chat as well, so please look there. I think there are some interesting suggestions from Sotirios and Katerina as well there, so make sure you look at those.